I will again welcome all of you to JTS and to this convening on Zionism today, tomorrow, and beyond. We all know that we are here today on Tuesday, 1 week before a highly consequential election in this country. We also know, because we've all been through the past few weeks, marking first the English date and then the Yahrzeit over Chag of the horrific massacres on October 7th. We have ended our collective year of mourning, but we, along with so many others, continue to hold an enormous amount of pain. We grieve the loss of Israeli and Palestinian life. We mourn the devastating impact that this ongoing war is having on so many. And we continue to pray, to march, and to advocate for the return of the hostages who have now been in captivity for 389 days. And so Zionism has been present in our minds this past year. We've been conscious of this in a particular way as an institution of higher education on Morningside Heights. JTS students, staff, and faculty witnessed and experienced firsthand the surge of anti-Semitism, and specifically anti-Zionism, that erupted a year ago. We encountered in our own backyard troubling statements, falsehoods, inflammatory rhetoric, violence, and troubling and deafening silence. Seemingly overnight, the word Zionism has become a vicious slur that all too often is used interchangeably with the word Jew. It is a fraught time for all of us, and the worries that are in our hearts today are interrelated in many different ways, compounding our concerns. So we've got a lot on our minds. Given all of this, we are especially grateful for your presence here today so that we can explore and address these concerns by learning together and listening to one another. JTS is uniquely positioned to facilitate this exchange. First, because its president at the beginning of the 20th century, Solomon Schechter, was among the first religious leaders in the United States, Jewish religious leaders in the United States, to publicly endorse Zionism, lending it credence as early as 1905. Second, JTS has always been an academic institution devoted to the goals of the academy: the search for truth, the honing of skills of critical inquiry and robust discourse, and at the same time, JTS is a religious institution, a Jewish institution dedicated to a robust Jewish future, in large measure by educating Jewish leaders committed to all of these ideals. JTS has championed these goals by bringing into conversation individuals who share a commitment both to intellectual engagement and to a deep religious and communal engagement with Judaism and the Jewish people. Last spring, we hosted a 2-day convening on anti-Semitism and allyship. We brought together academics, communal leaders, educators, rabbis, students, and concerned citizens to explore the history of anti-Semitism, the variety of shape-shifting forms that it has taken over the time, and the way it has manifested itself over time and space. Finally, we looked at the ways in which Jews and their allies have confronted anti-Semitism over the ages. Today, we do something similar with Zionism, a term that is equally misunderstood to deleterious effect. Moreover, common values and commitments concerning Zionism are fraying. fueling a growing sense of crisis. The moment is ripe for a deep dive to understand what is happening and then to reimagine and reassert the principles that will define Zionism for today's American Jewish community and its supporters. Devoted as we are to intellectual engagement and to reaffirming our commitment and bonds as American Jews to Zionism and the State of Israel, we will consider different expressions of Zionism, as well as how they've been influenced by periods of renewal, prosperity, and crisis. Together, we, all of us, will imagine what a hopeful and mutually beneficial relationship might look like in the present and the future. Not surprisingly, we don't expect to exhaust the topic of Zionism and all its manifestations and ramifications over these 2 days. So please mark your calendar for part 2 of this convening, which will take place on April 1st and 2nd. As you can see, this convening focuses on North American Jewish ties to Israel. Our next convening will focus more fully on the ways that Zionism is manifesting itself in the Israeli context and the impact this has both on Israel and on North American Jewry. I am extraordinarily grateful to Rabbi Dr. Vice Chancellor Gordon Tucker, our Vice Chancellor for Religious Life and Engagement, and Dr. Tamara Newman, our Director of Convenings, for conceiving and executing this marvelous convening that we all have the privilege of taking part in. And I want to thank them for bringing together such an extraordinary group of individuals to help us think through these issues. I'm now going to turn this over to my colleague, Rabbi Tucker.
Thank you. So since I am told that this is working now, so I can start by thanking our sound professionals. And thank you very much, Chancellor Schwartz. The turnout that we see before us this morning and the registration for the entire convening is so gratifying. It resoundingly vindicates the importance of this gathering. So thank you to all who have come to learn and to explore together this very timely and crucial subject. So what is it that motivates a convening, any convening? To answer that question, I'm turning to a powerful lecture that was given 5 years ago by Rabbi Jason Rubenstein, who will be one of the distinguished panelists in the convening tomorrow. The title of the talk was, "All Revelation Begins with Heartbreak." For this moment and for this convening, I want to paraphrase that as, all quests for renewal begin with heartbreak. And heartbreak begins with deep caring. It happens during those times when that which we cherish and revere does not live up to what we expect and need from it. Rabbi Rubenstein in his presentation was talking about Torah when it disappoints. And that motivated his compelling lesson. We have organized these 2 days because of the strong sense we have had that there is some disappointment, maybe even heartbreak, among American Jews who care deeply about Israel and Zionism and who want and need more. And that need particularly touches and concerns our younger generations. Stav Shafir, when she was in her first term as a very young woman in the Knesset a decade ago, she spoke for and to the generations born as she was in the mid-'80s and later. They came of age in a time in which an assassination and terrorism spawned significant shifts and rifts in politics and in public opinion. To her parliamentary colleagues, she spoke of, this is a quote, A politics that wants to make peace, that wants to improve relations between the different sectors of Israeli society, that believes in equal rights, in budgetary equity, that thinks that every single Israeli citizen deserves an equal portion. That, she said, is the true Zionism. In that address, she was expressing a certain heartbreak. I was born in 1951. And because of that, I and my cohort have known a Zionism that in significant measure resembled that of which she spoke and dreamed. And so my connection to Zionism is enduring and rock solid. But also because of that, the deep divisions today in what Zionism means and what it aspires to, and crucially, how those rifts affect American Jews, are to me a source of some heartbreak, and thus of a quest for understanding leading to renewal. But mostly I'm thinking, as so many of you are, of our children. I'm speaking of those like my daughter, who grew up hearing about the wonders of Israel from her parents and grandparents, and who has an enduring emotional connection to the land, the state, and the people. She and so many in her cohort care, but they feel the different kind of heartbreak of not having seen and experienced what their elders did. When will I feel the same thrill that my parents and grandparents had of a wondrous Israel? Many of them ask themselves that. And we dare not write them off, because their heartbreak is, as it always is, a sign of profound caring. And so we all gather here to discuss, to learn, to reimagine how that caring can be turned to pride and to an energetic desire to be part of the greatest story of the Jewish people in our time. Psalm 147 looks to God as the one who can heal broken hearts. In these 2 days, we will be trying to take at least a few steps in the tradition of imitatio Dei to move to greater wisdom and from there to healing and to renewal. And so now I am pleased to turn the podium over to Dr. Tamara Newman, JTS's Director of Convenings, to whom we are all very, very grateful for all her work in putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. My hope for this convening on the current state of Zionism and beyond is a dynamic conversation over 2 days among presenters with different roles, specializations, and professions. We hope to address the multiple facets of Zionism in a more complex way than is often available to the public. As Shuli and Gordon mentioned, this is a historic moment in so many different ways. And we'd like to provide everyone, and especially the next generation, with a sense of what came before in order to provide a solid foundation for what may come next and to maintain a degree of hopefulness. I'd like to thank and acknowledge the work of Chancellor Shuli Rubin Schwartz and Vice Chancellor Rabbi Gordon, without whom this would not be possible. I'd also like to thank our planning committee again Gordon, Chancellor Emeritus Arnie Eisen, and John Lopatin. Thanks also to Associate Provost Lisa Springer, Ellie Gettinger, and Aidan Fisher-Brown, Vice Chancellor Rabbi Joel Seltzer in Institutional Engagement, Beth Meyerowitz in Communications, Provost Jeff Kress, Ariel Halpern, Ilana Rosenbaum, Janie Schneider, Michelle Mehring, and too many others to name here. We encourage vigorous and thoughtful discussion. The interruption of speakers, no doubt, is not allowed. And with this, we begin our first session on the roots of Zionism, moderated by Dean Amy Kalmanovsky. Thank you.
One more. Good morning, everyone. Boker Tov. My name is Amy Kamenofsky. I'm a professor of Bible here at JTS, as well as the Dean of List College, our undergraduate program, and the Kext Graduate School. Welcome to our first session of the JTS convening, Zionism Today, Tomorrow, and Beyond. Indeed, throughout this convening, we will consider Zionism in its present and future forms, but in this session, we're going to begin with its past. Among the many things we have learned since October 7th is the importance of educating our community about the history of Zionism. We need to speak not only about the moment and from the heat of the moment, to respond productively to it. Historical context matters. And so, we open our convening on Zionism with some historical perspective. And we are lucky to have three extraordinary historians who will provide us with context and perspective that will lay a foundation not only for the discussions that we will have over the next 2 days, but for the conversations no doubt we will continue to have. Our panelists are, I guess just in the order of how you're sitting, Shuli Rubin Schwartz, Irving Lehrman Research Professor of American Jewish History and the 8th Chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary, Jonathan D. Sarna, University Professor and the Joseph H. and Belle R. Braun Professor of American Jewish History at Brandeis University. Professor Sarna also is the past president of the Association of Jewish Studies and chief historian of the National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia. And Jack Wertheimer, Joseph and Martha Menderson Professor of American Jewish History at the Jewish Theological Seminary. So just to give you a sense of how this is going to be structured, I will join our panelists in a moment. We will begin with questions addressed to our panelists before opening the conversation to audience questions. I will address each question to one of you and then allow the others of you to respond after that. And also, I hope it's okay that I think just in the interest of collegiality, I can use your first names? Good. Okay. Wonderful. All right. This is on now? Yes, excellent. All right, so let's start at the beginning. Why did the Zionist movement emerge in Europe in the late 19th century? And I'm going to ask Shuli to respond first.
Okay, thank you, Amy. I'm going to start us off by talking about the emergence of Zionism that preceded Theodor Herzl, and then I think my colleagues will take it in other directions. As we know, there are so many different forms of Zionism. I want to focus particularly on the Chibat Zion movement, the Lovers of Zion movement, a group of Eastern European Jews who felt at around 1881 in Tsarist Russia that their eyes were turned to Zion for many reasons. Part of it, of course, were the pogroms and discriminatory policies of Tsarist Russia at that time. Part of it was a desire to work the land in Eretz Yisrael, and an even smaller number of observant Jews who wanted to come to the land of Israel because by working the land, it would enable them to fulfill many more mitzvot that can only be fulfilled when one is living in the land. This form of Zionism was also part of a nationalistic impulse common in Europe in the 19th century, marked by the desire to create the essential building blocks of nationhood. And this, first and foremost, involved creating a distinctive language for what might become the Jewish nation in the land of Israel. We know of this from the most famous practitioner, Eliezer ben Yehuda, best known as the father of modern Hebrew, who did this in a fanatical way by speaking only Hebrew to his immediate family members, which meant inventing words by the dozens and hundreds. This movement also was furthered by the Hebrew press, starting with Hamilit, the first Hebrew paper in Russia, which eventually became the mouthpiece of this Chibat Zion movement. Having a newspaper helped unite those few, at that time, crazy people who were speaking a language that nobody else spoke in Europe. And then by publishing the writings of Ahad Ha'am, Nachman Bialik, and other writers, it nurtured not only an evolving Hebrew language, but also the field of Hebrew literature. I can't really talk about this without speaking personally, because this is a stock that I come from. My great-grandfather was the Eliezer ben Yehuda of his shtetl, according to the Yizkor book of that town. It was the only bayit in the shtetl of Kremenetz where Hebrew was spoken. When he was threatened by a second arrest by Tsarist authorities, he decided to leave. But instead of going to Palestine, he was going to Denver, Colorado, because his siblings were there and they could cover the travel expenses of the family. I want to share a few excerpts from his diary, which he wrote while he was on the train to Warsaw, en route to the United States, but there were a lot of other people on the train who were en route to Palestine. His words, which he later translated, give us an understanding of how he understood his Zionist commitments. He wrote, "I dreamt sometimes of leaving this country, but for the sake of an entirely different country, of that country to which I am bound historically, love for which I had sucked in with my mother's milk, for the restoration of which I have worked all my life. I dreamt of leaving this country for the sake of that country, which, although I was never there, every corner of it is well known to me and loved by me. Each name, as of those places that are mentioned in the Bible, so of the new colonies there, sounds so sweet in my ears. Hebron, Yerushalayim, Beit Lechem, Petach Tikva, Rishon LeZion, Merchavia. How beautiful, how charming are these names. There, to Palestine, had my heart always attracted me. And suddenly, America? What does the name say to my soul? What relation to me has Denver, Colorado, where I am going?" You can feel that his Zionism was inextricably linked to his love of the Bible, to the historical ties of Jews to the land of Israel, and to his recognition that Jews like him needed a safe haven in the land of Israel. He was crestfallen not to be on his way to Eretz Yisrael, and envious of his fellow travelers who were. Thankfully, for his mental health, he reframed his thinking so that by the time he reached the end of the journey to Warsaw, he wrote this: "The last events in Russia and Ukraine," by which he meant the violent pogroms in 1918 and 19 in Ukraine, that had ruined in a terrible manner the largest part of the Jewish people, must open the eyes of all the Jews of the world to understand that we can be secured in the future from such ruin only when we will have our own land. All our hopes should now be turned to Palestine and America. As in the first, so in the second, we need pioneers. In the first, to build up the land. In the second, to wake up our American brethren to give material for the building. Thus, we made up a compromise Everyone's voyage is not in vain. We will all be engaged in furthering our national aspiration. In different ways, we will work for one purpose. In other words, the nationalist ideal was larger, in his view, than making Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael. Those going to Palestine and those going to the United States could do their part to further the Zionist cause. Now, he couldn't do that in a material way because he was a new immigrant to the United States who was a Jewish educator. But what he did was he, along with the Hebrew poet Ephraim Lisitsky, ran a 6-day-a-week Talmud Torah in New Orleans, one of the pioneers of the Ivrit B'Ivrit method of Jewish education, teaching Hebrew in Hebrew. He was part of a cohort of like-minded Jewish educators who greatly increased Hebrew literacy in the United States and who infused Jewish education with the Zionist spirit. In doing so, he and his colleagues strengthened not only Jewish literacy, but Jewish pride, Jewish self-confidence, and Jewish self-determination. I think I'm going to stop here. There's so much more.
Okay.
And
we'll just take it. So, Jonathan, if you
take it away.
Well, thank you, and let me say how pleased I am to be back here at JTS, and excuse me, grateful to Chancellor Schwartz and others for inviting me. I want to talk about kind of multiple beginnings and roots of Zionism. The first will surprise many people because we are used to thinking of Zionism in intellectual terms. But the truth is, just as today the digital revolution lies behind so many developments, so the great industrial revolution, specifically steam travel, made Zionism possible. Had there not been steam, there would never have been Zionism. It's easy to show that. In 1800, when Jews thought about how to get to Zion, so they talked about flying on eagle's wings or going on a cloud to Zion. In other words, they, and it's true everywhere, they assumed supernatural means would be required. But steam meant we know how to get there. We know how to begin, how to end. Steam transformed the very idea of travel. The very first ship from America to get to the land of Israel in steam travel is very famous because Mark Twain was aboard. He wrote a book, Innocents Abroad. The ship was called the Quaker City, and it was able, they knew when they were starting and ending. So suddenly, going back to Zion is practical. I don't have to wait for eagles and clouds. I know how to do it. And we often forget how technology underlies crucial developments. So that's point one. Point two, 1881, which the Chancellor mentioned, was an October, if I can be anachronistic, was an October 7th moment in Jewish history. Prior to the assassination of Alexander II in 1881, Jews in Russia were actually very optimistic. They had a liberal czar. He had freed the serfs. He had made life better for Jews. Liberal Jews went to the fields and worked with the Narodniki. They worked with the peasants, and they were very optimistic. And it all came crashing down after 1881. To read those descriptions in the wake of October 7th, the first meetings in synagogues, and people cried for 15 minutes in one brilliant account that Dubnov preserves. Why? Because everything they had believed and hoped collapsed. And that's the background for what the chancellor was showing. They saw no hope suddenly. All their hopes had been dashed, and suddenly there were two possibilities. The movement is sometimes called La'an, whither, where should we go? The great article was written by someone here at the seminary, Geffen. La'an, should we go to America? Should we go to Palestine? There were important debates between the two. There were crucial differences. If you went to America, you didn't think the diaspora, quad diaspora, was the problem. You thought particular governments, particular modes of organizing society were the problem, but a different diaspora could work fine, and the liberal idea would be preserved. If you felt that Zion was the only way to solve the problem, like Hovevei Zion, then you believed no diaspora was safe for Jews. The only possibility was to go and build a Jewish land. So that was the second beginning. And the third, in the 1890s, what had begun in Eastern Europe, suddenly Vienna, which is about 9% Jewish. There's no American city today, I think, that's 9% Jewish, but Vienna was. And Vienna suddenly has an anti-Semitic mayor. And anti-Semitism is running rampant in Central Europe, public in a way that it had not been before. The American writer Mark Twain is in Vienna at that time and is shocked. And he writes a number of essays. His most famous essay, which bears rereading, is called Concerning the Jews. And it's very interesting that in Concerning the Jews, based on his experience in Vienna, Mark Twain mentions Theodor Herzl and Herzl's plan. I can tell you, because I'm writing a book on it, that Mark Twain knew Theodor Herzl. There's correspondence between them. This wasn't just I've been reading. But in any case, he cites Herzl and the plan for Zion. He a little bit pokes fun at Herzl's idea. But if you read through the joke, you can also see why he respects the idea. And certainly the rise of anti-Semitism in places where Jews had not expected it had a big role in promoting Zionism. So those would be three key European developments that I'd like to point to, and my colleague will show all the things we've missed.
On the contrary, I'm going to pick up on your theme of steam. You've spoken vividly about steam. I want to add another dimension of steam, namely that the Zionists motivated most other Jews to have steam coming out of their ears because they were furious at the Zionists. And I raise this because I think we need to put the theme on the table today, and I'm sure we will, that the Zionist movement was a fighting cause. And the Zionists, when they emerged, were fighters. They were provocative. They were raising very challenging questions. And their antagonists within the Jewish community reciprocated in kind. We know that families were riven between Zionist and anti-Zionist Jews in the late 19th century, the early decades, and in the early decades of the 20th century as well. Some of the antagonists of those Zionists were furious because Zionism was undermining some of their most significant ideological assumptions. Western Jews assumed and made the claim, put forward the claim, that we will acculturate in this country. Often this is referred to as an assimilationist agenda. I don't like that word because they didn't want to disappear as Jews, but they certainly wanted to be well integrated as Jews. And the Zionists poked them and said, wait a minute, take a look, be realistic, because the reality is that we're not being accepted as Jews fully. That was clearly the case, and Professor Sarna mentioned that in Russia when the pogroms broke out, but it was true also in the very same period of time in Western and Central Europe, the allusion, of course, to Vienna, but it wasn't only in Vienna, it was also in other parts of Central Europe, and even so, progressing even further west into France and England, and even in the United States, anti-Semitism was surging during the last 2 decades of the 19th century. And the Zionists were pointing to that and saying, it's very nice that we Jews feel that we should be accepted here and fully tolerated here, but let's be realistic. And that really bugged a great many Jews, especially Jewish leadership in all of those countries. In Eastern Europe, the Zionists also had their antagonists. The first Zionist Congress was held in 1897. In that exact same year, another movement was founded in Eastern Europe called the Bund, the League of Jewish Workers in Poland and Lithuania. And that Bund was an anti-Zionist organization. And the reason that these two different groups clashed was because Zionists stated 2 things. One, as we've already heard, the Zionist movement can revive Jewish life in the diaspora in various countries. But second of all, ultimately, we have to build I'm struggling for the word because they didn't necessarily use the word state, even though Herzl did. We have to build something in Palestine, what was then called Palestine. And the Bundists were adamantly opposed to that because from their perspective, the work that needs to be done in the diaspora. When the Great Revolution occurs, is that a Bundist calling? When the Great Revolution occurs, we are going to be solving the Jewish problem. There's a famous Russian non-Jew revolutionary of the time by the name of Plekhanov, who once famously stated, what is a Bundist? A Bundist is a Zionist who's afraid of seasickness. Some of my students don't get that line. I'm glad you did.
That's great.
So just to wrap this up, the great challenges that Zionism was addressing in its early period of time was, to quote my former professor, Arthur Hertzberg, on the one hand, to address the Jewish problem, which was rising anti-Semitism, and also the problem of Judaism, Namely, how is Judaism going to thrive in modern societies where assimilation was beginning to take off quite rampantly?
Thank you. Excellent. Second question, we have 5 more plans, so we'll see how we go, because we want to have some time for audience questions as well. America was a prime destination for Jewish immigrants from the 1880s to 1924. How did the Zionist movement take hold in North America, and what forms did it take? And I'd like to begin with you, Jonathan.
Well, thank you. It's not often enough mentioned, so let me start with a woman. You've all heard about her, but most people don't realize how crucial she was in Zionism, and her name was Emma Lazarus. We think of Emma Lazarus, give us your tired, your poor, at the Statue of Liberty. But I strongly commend to your attention her epistle to the Hebrews, which is, in many ways, the most important early Zionist work in America. And it's worth asking why, and Professor Wertheimer, I think, set up the reason. Emma Lazarus understood perfectly well, because she worked with immigrants, that America could not possibly be home to all of the Jews of Eastern Europe, and indeed, many Jews in America were quite worried what would happen to their status if too many immigrants came. I'll come back to that point. She was quite right, of course. But the other thing that she's concerned about is that a lot of Jews won't come to America because they want to continue to observe a deep Jewish way of life. I think she mentioned Hasidim, and they can't do that in America. Emma Lazarus knew that perfectly well, because she herself had abandoned so much of Jewish life. And so the solution was, let them go and build in the Holy Land. There's plenty of room, and she becomes excited about that. There's no doubt that she has read Pinsker's Auto-Emancipation, and she sees, in a way, these two places. America, you're tired, you're poor, but also the land of Israel. So that's one thing that happens. We've already heard that there were Chovevei Zion who came to America. Some of them later would be quite active. They'd sell what they call shekels, and there were plenty of American Jews who owned a piece of land in the land of Israel, and hoped one day that they would develop it. And it's quite sad that the very best book on early Zionism, pre-Brandeis in America, is in Hebrew and never translated. So the Israelis don't read it because it's about America, and the Americans don't read it because it's in Hebrew. But Eviatar Friesel's book gives a good sense of that early Zionism from the 1880s until World War I. Now, then we have, and we shouldn't forget this, notwithstanding the reform movement's official opposition to Zionism, there are several prominent reform rabbis, Gustav Gottheil at Temple Emmanuel, Bernard Felsenthal in Chicago, who buck their own movement and come out strongly for Zionism, which they believe is necessary to combat assimilatory trends in American Jewish life. Both are highly patriotic Americans, but they don't think that America can be the future for all Jews. And Zion offers an alternative where you don't face the same Christian pressure to assimilate. And that brings me finally to World War I. We forget. World War I was the greatest tragedy the Jews had known to that time. The Shtetlach, the little communities where Jews lived in border areas, were destroyed. Go back, it's online in the American Jewish Yearbook, and see the list of one shtetl after another destroyed, their residents murdered and raped and kidnapped. Sound familiar? And a solution had to be found. And to make it even worse, America was becoming more and more restrictionist. There are more and more calls to end immigration. It's changing America. These immigrants, they're unassimilable. They didn't use the word garbage, but it was pretty close. And they are inferior to the real Americans. Louis Brandeis, who is not yet a Supreme Court justice, living in Washington, he was tremendously aware of these currents, even though he had not been involved in Jewish matters. He felt suddenly a surge of responsibility. We've got to do something to help save Jewry. And when Jacob de Haas, who was an agent of Herzl and was the editor of the Jewish Advocate, comes to him, he responds, and he agrees to take on the leadership of the Zionist movement. Remember, the leadership had been in Germany, which is the enemy. So suddenly there's a big reorganization. Brandeis takes over. One can never underestimate the importance of Louis Brandeis. I say that not just because I teach at university, named for him, but Brandeis, because of who he is able to remake the Zionist movement in a way that made it exciting to Jews and to Americans generally. Basically, he makes it part of the progressive movement and part of Woodrow Wilson's broader strategy to spread the American dream outward. All that he wanted to accomplish in America, only some of which was accomplished, he thought could be accomplished in the new Commonwealth. That's a new word, and it's a Brandeis word, and his friends, social commonwealth, and so on, will be accomplished in Zion. In other words, for Brandeis and for American Jews, Zion becomes a projection of America as it ought to be. And that's what they are going to build in the land of Israel. This is a mission. Brandeis considers it the most exciting project, and he was involved in some pretty exciting ones, that he's going to do. And then, of course, Brandeis is appointed to the Supreme Court, and that's fabulous for Zionists. How can you say Zionism is un-American? How can steam come out of your ears if such an important Zionist is on the Supreme Court? Or as Brandeis and his supporters said, Woodrow Wilson doesn't seem to think it's un-American. And so Brandeis has a lot to do with the fact that Zionism grows during World War I. It actually grows fourfold in a short number of years in World War I, and the whole Zionist movement is reorganized, becoming, that's the beginning of the Zionist Organization of America, quite different than its contemporary institution, and with Brandeis at the helm. Now, much happened afterwards and had ups and downs, but I think those are the beginnings.
Yeah, you're next. Right. You and then Julie.
Okay, fine. This is directed particularly to Chancellor Schwartz. You got life very easy. One of your predecessors, distinguished predecessors, was President Louis Finkelstein. And I came across a letter that was written to him by a Mr. Sulzberger, who had something to do with a newspaper in New York City. I forget the exact date of the letter, but Mr. Sulzberger was had steam coming out of his ears because he wrote, I saw a photograph of a commencement held at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and there was a flag there. What is a Zionist flag doing at the commencement of the Jewish Theological Seminary? Finkelstein responded, no, you've got it wrong. If you look more closely, it's not a Zionist flag at all. I forget what kind of flag it was. But the point is that this is an example of the kind of pressure that was exerted by those sectors of the American Jewish community that were either non or anti-Zionist. Nothing particularly new at the New York Times. That's my editorial comment for the day. So what I want to raise, I said earlier before we began to our distinguished moderator that I'm going to be the anti-Zionist on the panel. I'll talk about the anti-Zionists because there were many within the community. And I want to just briefly talk about some of the key sectors here, and I'm not going to steal your fire. So one sector, and Professor Son already alluded to this, was in the reform camp. The reform movement in its Pittsburgh platform of the mid-1880s already made it very clear that this was a movement before the Zionist movement came into existence in 1897, that we do not have the aspiration of ever returning to the land of Israel. That's not where we are. And then when the Zionist movement arose, the reform movement for several decades, not today of course, but for several decades, took an anti-Zionist stance. Because again, it conflicted with the acculturationist ideology of that movement. Our future here is in America, it's not there, it's here. And similarly, in the Orthodox right, I don't have a good word for this. I use the word Haredi, but that's an anachronism to use that kind of term. But nonetheless, there were Orthodox Jews who were quite hostile to Zionism as well, because, first of all, the Zionist leadership was primarily secular, and second of all, because of their belief that such secular leaders can't be legitimate Jewish leaders, after all. They're secular. And so there was opposition to that. There were other elements, of course, as well. The point being that there was opposition within the American Jewish community also to Zionism. And yes, there were Reform rabbis who, in fact, rose to the leadership position of the Zionist movement in the early decades of the 20th century, and then beyond that, in the middle decades also. But the movement itself was hostile, anti-Zionist and eventually non-Zionist. And the same thing within the Orthodox world as well. It took time for that position to change. And here there's a similarity between what was going on in European Jewish communities, where again, the primary position of the Haredi communities in Eastern Europe, as well as in Germany, was to be anti-Zionist. And here, one very brief anecdote. I grew up in a synagogue in which one of the grandsons of Rabbi Joseph Breuer, sons of Rabbi Joseph Breuer, a grandson of Samson Raphael Hirsch, was a member. And I vividly remember as a kid, sometime back in the last century, that when the rabbi of the synagogue would speak positively about Israel, this man would walk out of the synagogue until 1967, and then he stayed put. My point being that in the Orthodox world also, clearly there's a religious Zionist movement within Orthodoxy, but the mainstream leadership of those communities was also anti-Zionist. What about the conservative movement?
So what about the conservative movement? So first, Sulzberger was just a iteration of what Salman Schechter had to deal with Jacob Schiff. The leadership of JTS at that time were Reform Jews who were either anti-Zionist or non-Zionist. And yes, Schechter was taking a very bold step when he, in 1905, published in 1906, came out in support of Zionism. He in a sense, was torn. And many of his colleagues, the faculty at JTS, were torn. They were drawn for all the reasons that I talked about earlier. The romantic sense of the growth, rebirth of Jewish culture, of Jewish literature, of the Lashon Kodesh, that it could be there be a modern Hebrew language. He was very much drawn to that kind of Zionism. He was very wary of Theodor Herzl for the same reason that the Orthodox were. He was a traditional Jew. He I would say, didn't quite know what to do with this desire to work the land and to create something that was completely secular. The normalization that Herzl wanted, right? That whatever state is created in the land of Israel should be a state like every other state, right? That's what's going to make it successful. Schechter was not a fan. But as we know, as you know, Schechter had a twin brother who was a farmer in Zichron Yaakov. So the pull of Eretz Yisrael was there for him. And in the end, he, having recently come, right, he took over as president in 1902. By 1905, he had issued this statement. Now, some of it is, to go back to what you said, Jack, about Reform Judaism, some of it was, how do I differentiate the Jewish Theological Seminary from the Reform movement, right? So the Reform is so rabidly anti-Zionist, and he understood that Zionism had the potential to serve as a counterforce to the assimilatory tendencies of American Jews, right? He understood that it could be, in his famous phraseology, a bulwark against assimilation, that he wrote in this major statement, he wrote, Zionism has succeeded in bringing back to the fold many men and women, both here and in Europe, who otherwise would have been lost to Judaism. It has given them a new interest in the synagogue and everything Jewish, and put before them an ideal worthy of their love and sacrifice. Okay, if he felt that Zionism could do that, he was all in, and he really put JTS on the map in that way, in being all in a moment, as you said, when the vast number of Jews and of American Jews were not Zionists, right? As you said, Jonathan, yes, Zionism increased fourfold during Brandeis's era, but was still tiny, right? And it took then again many more decades before Zionism became a mainstream, and we'll get to that. You know, as Schechter saw that potential, he also shifted in his views about political Zionism. And he ended up speaking at the 13th Zionist Congress. So he was pragmatic in that sense and understood that, okay, we got to work with everyone because Zionism has the potential of being a rich way of regenerating Judaism and the Jewish people. I also want to talk a little bit about Henrietta Zold and her role in Zionism here. We know that she was the first female student here at JTS. She was the founder of Hadassah, the largest Zionist group in the United States, and the most successful Jewish women's volunteer organization. She, like Schechter, really supported Zionism as a means to enriching Judaism. She too understood her Zionism in a way as a way to counter Reform Judaism. You know, when she wrote, the Zionist ideal is even larger than Palestine itself. The upbuilding of Palestine is a symbol, the concrete expression of your Zionist conviction that Judaism must be changed back from a creed to a way of life. That is a direct dig to reform, right? Even a successful economic upbuilding of Palestine will remain an empty shell unless you and the whole of Jewry fill the work for Palestine with Jewish content, with high ethical aspirations, with just thinking and just action. Another way that Zold played a critical role here in her Zionism is that she understood that Zionism could be a catalyst to enrich the knowledge of American Jews about Judaism, in particular Jewish women, right? Zionism, Hadassah started as a group, as study circles that were studying about the history of the Jews and the history of Zionism. And and always Hadassah was concerned with the ways in which it could support the fledgling communities in the land of Israel, but also to enrich the learning and to empower American Jewish women. The other thing that's important about Zold is that we've been talking about the ideas of Zionism, but she also, interesting, you know, as you talked before about, Jonathan, about Zionism becoming more popular when you could show its confluence with progressive values, progressivism. And Zold felt that very deeply, only her progressive ideals were less those of Wilson's and more those of Jane Addams and Lillian Wald, right? The work that they were doing in improving the lives of immigrants and impoverished individuals in the urban areas in which they lived. Well, that's exactly what she was doing, only she was worried about the impoverished community in the land of Israel. And so she said, well, you know, the men, they can go talk to the heads of the Ottoman Empire. They can knock themselves out with all the, you know, heads of state, the sultans and around the world. In the meantime, there's no healthcare system in the land of Israel. So I'm gonna establish a visiting nurses, what became the visiting nurses system. I'm gonna establish a medical unit. And importantly, all the health care that she established was for all the inhabitants of the land of Israel. So finally, the last point about Zold, and this will become important, is that she was prescient in anticipating the calling out the challenges posed by Jews living in the land of Israel who came to a land that was already inhabited by Arabs living in the land of Israel. In her words and in her deeds, she promoted the importance of cultivating ways for Jews and Arabs to learn, work, and live together. And she wrote in the 30s, I am heartbroken because the Jews don't seem to realize that the Arab question and the way they're going to solve it are the supreme test. Matters are not going to be mended if the alienation between us and the Arab population, it is emphasized. It is not the way. This way of creating race compartments, it is not the way of healing the breach, of destroying the seeds of race hatred.
Yeah. All right, so in the interest of time, I'm going to take the moderator's prerogative. I'm going to actually skip the next question and go to the final three questions. Just ask each of you to respond individually and not have the three of you, share. And then we can open up to questions from the audience. So, Jonathan, I'm going to ask the question, how do today's Jewish non-Zionists and anti-Zionists compare to those of an earlier time?
So in some ways, they do, and indeed, Professor Wertheimer mentioned Buddhism. I was interested to learn that on my campus, there's now a little group of neo-Buddhists, as they call themselves. So, the old is new again. They're similar in a few ways. I think that the non-Zionists and anti-Zionists were frightened about their status in liberal America, and I think many Jews, especially those who have been deeply involved in liberal causes, all of which, let us remember, turned on Jews on October 7th, are deeply worried we're going to be homeless. And so that, I think, is similar. Fear about status. The second point, which we haven't much talked about, that is similar, the non-Zionists, the anti-Zionists, and the vast majority of American Zionists, including Louis Brandeis, disagreed with a key idea in political Zionists. They never imagined that they personally would make Aliyah. They wanted Zion for persecuted Jews abroad. After immigration is mostly cut off in 1924, they wanted Zion for all those Jews who hadn't won the lottery and come to America. They needed a place. The very first year that more European Jews go to Eretz Israel than America is 1925, the year after the restrictions come into effect. That's very telling. So that, I think, is similar. But what is striking to me is that whereas non-Zionists and anti-Zionists, they had an alternative to offer, whether it was the liberal state or whether, like Israel Zangwill, they wanted to settle Jews in lots of places, Jewish territorialism, as it was known. They put forth alternatives. I mean, neo-Bundism aside, I don't see that some of the people speaking today really offer an alternative. Half the Jewish people almost live in the land of Israel. It's astonishing how weak is the response, from the river to the sea. Well, what's going to happen to all those Jews when it's free means free of Jews? Where are those Jews going to go? And even though I've heard at some rallies, well, they'll go back to Poland, that didn't work out very well, as I remember. And I'm here because my grandfather, we're talking about our grandparents, my grandfather had the good sense to leave Poland after World War I. And most of us have similar stories. So in that respect, the question of alternative solutions, whereas in an earlier day they offered many, it seems to me that today we are not hearing many. And in some ways, today's anti-Zionists are searching for roots and legitimation. There have been several new books in the earlier period, but when you actually look back to that earlier period, it seems to me that it was a very different situation, very different sets of possibilities, and many of the solutions that were alternatives, say the Orthodox Rabbonim who said, don't go to the Treifen of Medina and don't go to the land of Israel ruled by the secular Zionists. Stay in the great land of Hungary. And you can see the last gasp of that. I think it was the Munkacher Rebbe on YouTube. And it's hair-raising because we know what happened to the Jews who took that advice. And they couldn't have known that. Today's Jews should know it. And that, I think, is a difference.
Okay, thank you. Shuli, how do we explain the significantly lower support for Israel among younger American Jews today?
Okay, in brief, so we have time to open this up. We heard Gordon Tucker speak about this earlier. Young Jews grew up with a completely different Israel than those of us closer to Rabbi Tucker's age, which includes me, and have a very different understanding of Israel. Some of the love, the nostalgia, the excitement of Israel in its early years, and then the horror and pain and fear in May of 1967, and then again in 1973 with the Yom Kippur War. These were realities for many of us in in 1967, just 20 years after the Holocaust. And young Jews born in the 21st century are seeing a powerful state of Israel, that warts and all, and that necessarily creates a different sensibility and sense of loyalty. I just also have to mention the way, look, I think there are questions about the education of young Jews in general, the Jewish education of young Jews, and the ways in which they have been educated about Judaism. So I'll just put a pin in that. The lack of alignment, you know, we talked about how Zionism was popular when it aligned with the liberal progressive values that we cared about as Americans. And as those ideals diverge, it becomes more problematic. So for some, yes, there was a rude awakening on October 7, and you know, we must name the ways in which higher education has changed over the last 20 years, the ways in which young people in the humanities have been educated, and a lot of these theories, whether it be settler colonialism, concerns about oppression and justice. This is the life experience of young people who study the humanities in this century, and we have seen this is what exploded on October 7th, but it has a long history in the academy. I'll stop. And, you know, we can always go
Excellent.
back
And
to
before
that.
we open this up to audience questions, Jack, I'm going to ask you to be our prophet for the moment. So what might this portend for the future? And what, if anything, might those who favor strong American Jewish support for and identification with Israel consider doing to ensure the next generation of American Jews will be as committed as previous generations?
Okay, before I turn to playing prophet, I want to kind of circle back to some of the things that have just been said now, and perhaps say them a lot more directly and offensively, for that matter, also. One of the questions that we were going to be discussing, but we're running short on time, is when did American Jews overwhelmingly become supporters of Israel? I didn't use the word Zionist, supporters of Israel. We clearly see evidence of this building during the 1940s. And certainly one piece of evidence we have for this is the tremendous rise in the sums of money that American Jews were donating, prepared to donate to Israel. Just to give a quick example in terms of dollar sums, in the early 1940s, remember it's wartime, somewhere between $28 and $30 million were given by American Jews to the combined UJA and Federation campaigns. 1948, that figure jumped to $200 million, which in today's dollars is $2.6 billion. And that's 1948, when the economic boom had only begun to take off in America. And there were lots of American Jews who still were gradually only entering into the middle class. I think that the major turning point was in 1967. One of the writers in 1973, after that war, was Norman Podhoretz, who wrote an article in the New York Times Magazine which began by saying something to the effect of 99% of American Jews are now Zionists. What did he base that on? I have no idea, because no opinion surveys were taken in that period of time yet. But here's the other part of it. 1967 was a turning point for an additional reason. It was in that period of time that the left in America, which had had a love affair with Israel, remember the kibbutzim, socialism, Ben-Gurion and his labor movement, right? These were all great, according to the left. Suddenly, Israel became a winner in 1967 and again 1973, and now the left turned, the American left turned on Israel. And that has progressed. And so I want to throw out a dirty word here that has to be said. If you want to understand young people and what has happened to them, we have to talk about the influence of the progressives in this country. I'm not talking about liberals now. I'm talking about progressives who have turned on Israel. That's been a process that's been going on for the last 50 or 60 years or so already. But it clearly is evident to anybody who's prepared to open their eyes up. And as a result of that, we also know from surveys that the American Jews who are least supportive of Israel are those who identify themselves, according to the Pew study of 2020, prepared to identify themselves as very liberal. Very liberal. I'm not talking about liberal now, okay? So the influence of the progressives has been enormous on this generation. Second of all, we're talking about the social media, and yes, the mainstream media, which largely has turned on Israel also. That has had an impact on young people too. So when you ask me to project to the future, one of the questions is it realistic to expect that young American Jews are going to be less influenced by progressives? Is it realistic to imagine that they're going to become suddenly much more willing to be supportive of fellow Jews? I don't know the answer to that question. But I do know that one important area that we have to think about constructively is Jewish education. And by that, I'm talking about both about what is being taught to them about Israel and what is also being taught to them about, my favorite expression, Jewish values. Jewish values. What are Jewish values? We all know. Tikkun olam. I don't know how to say that in Hebrew, I'm afraid. But Tikkun olam, it's an old joke, okay? Tikkun olam has conveyed that message of Tikkun Olam, which has been promoted within Jewish educational circles across the spectrum. You can find Orthodox rabbis Tikkun Olaming away also. That has given young people the understanding that the key aspect of being Jewish is to be a good person and to support the right causes. It has not taught them that they have a first responsibility to their fellow Jews. And unless we are prepared to deliver that message, not to the exclusion of caring about other people, but that Jews have a special responsibility, like all people do, to care first for their family members, for their kin, for their own people. Until that happens, we're not going to be able to reverse that. All that having been said, what do we know about Jewish anti-Zionists in this country? They represent, fortunately, a small population, somewhere around 10% of American Jewish adults, based on the most recent surveys conducted in the last year. But unfortunately, amongst college students, we have a larger percentage, somewhere in the vicinity of 15% or so, who describe themselves as anti-Zionist, and another population of about 20% who are just not sure whether there really ought to be a state of Israel. How did this come about? And I'm submitting to you it came about, number one, because of the messages of progressivism in this country, progressive ideology, and also because of the bad messages delivered by Jewish education, which focus heavily, if not exclusively, on Tikkun Olam, as opposed to balancing that, also with the message that Jews have a responsibility to take care of their own, just like every other people has a first responsibility to take care of their own.
All right, so we have hands up and we have a wandering mic, so take it away. Gordon, you want to, yeah.
Whoops. Professor Wertheimer, your comments just now are the perfect segue to the question I wanted to ask. Chancellor Schwartz, I heard with great interest what you said about Henrietta Zold's concern about Jewish-Arab relations in Israel. Nonetheless, I'm very curious to know if in her promotion of efforts on behalf of impoverished Jewish communities in the land of Israel, did she get pressure here that here she was an American advocate, an American leader, and I'm asking, and ignoring the impoverished communities in her own backyard in favor of Jewish impoverished communities over there, right? So was the tension between universalism, protect the impoverished communities here, versus particularism, protect the impoverished Jewish communities over there, was she subject to that tension in her advocacy?
Not to my knowledge. Yeah.
I was just going to add, because it's so little known, not so much on that question. To this day, there is exactly one sector in Israel where Jews and Arabs work side by side. You see them working together, and that's the medical sector. Hadassah Hospital, pharmacies, and the like. That all goes back to Henrietta Zoll. She insisted over the objections of many of the Zionist elite that she would only support, which meant her Hadassah members would only support it if it was open to all, and we don't realize what a long influence that has had. So next time you're in Israel in a medical setting and see someone from an Arab background, thank Henrietta Zoll.
Great, thank you.
Ariel.
So I agree with everything that's said about the decline in support among young Jews for Israel, but nothing was said about things actually happening in Israel. So I wonder if the panelists do not think that things like the occupation or the fact that since 2008 the government of Israel has not been trying to pursue peace, do you think that it's not had also an influence on support for Israel in the U.S.?
I understood it.
I'll
let you answer.
Okay. Our discussion has been about anti-Zionists and non-Zionists. It's not been about critics of Israel. I personally don't think anybody does, put critics of Israel into those categories at all. The question is, why is it, my question at least is, why is it that Jews who I self-identify as anti-Zionists have empathy for all kinds of other people, but have no empathy for the Jewish people who are suffering in Israel? That's very different from raising the question about, is this Israeli policy humanitarian? Is that Israeli policy to be questioned? That's a very different set of issues, and it's not the issues of this panel.
Hi. First of all, thank you so much for this really engaging conversation. I'm Shira Hecht-Kohler from here in New York. I had a question about the role of Hebrew language and sort of specifically when looking at the younger generation, in what way do you think that, I suppose, the demise of the knowledge of the Hebrew language across the board, really in all Jewish communities, contributes to the sort of minimization of the feelings of Zionism? Really, to know a culture, you really need to be intimate with its music, its contemporary culture, and we're really seeing just lots of different reasons, but think of just translations, all sorts of reasons contributing to a real decline in the knowledge of Hebrew. So I guess it's a two-pronged question. One, how does that, in your mind, and this is really to everyone, impact the sort of lessening and loosening of the ties? And as an educational institution, how do you imagine fixing that from the ground up?
I think about that in a broader context, I would say, and that is one of the things that I think has happened is that there have been a lot of programs to Israel, a lot of opportunities to bring Americans to Israel, the whole birthright phenomenon. But I would say that is not matched by the actual building of relationships between Americans and Israelis. And empathy comes from connection and relationship. Language is certainly part of it, but I think that that is one of the reasons that makes this alienation possible, is that particularly for non-Orthodox Jews who are less likely to have family living in Israel, there isn't that personal tie and connection. You see it in the way that American Jews have responded over this past year. Those of us who have relatives living in Israel, it's very different reality. Relatives or close friends or individuals that we care about and can be in daily or weekly contact with. And that, I think, is part of the broader context that can allow this kind of dissipating sense of concern, responsibility for our Jewish family writ large that, as you said, most of the Jews in the world now live in Israel. So, yeah.
There was a question right in the front.
I think, yeah.
Hi. One on that side?
First of all, thank you for this program, and thank you, sir, for your kind comments about the medical institutions in Israel. I'm a physician. I've been there many times, and it's a great source of pride, what Hadassah Hospital has in it, and the cooperation between Arab and Jew. It's like a brotherhood, a sisterhood. It's really gorgeous. I don't know what it is right this minute, but that's my previous visits. It was quite something to be proud of. Where do we go from here? I am here out of great, deep concern as someone who loves Israel and is not afraid to say I'm a Zionist. I'm here out of concern for how we redress our young people. I have skin in the game. I have a college grandson. How do we redress with them basic history about Israel, basic concepts about, even in this horrible war, the things that are being done that are trying to soften blows to various people? How do they answer professors who are prejudiced against Israel, prejudiced against Jews? How do we teach them now? We need bullet points. We need PR. Do you agree?
I think almost everyone in the field of Jewish education realizes that teaching Israel will be very high on the agenda. Rethinking how we teach Israel will be very high on the agenda going forward. I think it's not just Israel, but honestly, and Dara Horn has written eloquently on this, the teaching of Holocaust, which was universalized and de-Judaized, and we're paying a tremendous price for that. So yes, there's a very long agenda once the war ends, but on that agenda, I think, will be the teaching of Israel and rethinking the Holocaust. I do want to point out, which is little known, that the current generation of college students did not have an opportunity, for the most part, to go to Israel on birthright. COVID meant that they didn't get there. And we're paying a big price for that. Many of those young people have not been to Israel, don't know Israel. And we shouldn't give up on birthright, quite the contrary. As soon as possible, certainly our most successful program of its kind in the history of the state, we need to redouble efforts. Go, see for yourself. Don't listen to what others tell you. Use your own eyes and experience. And I actually think that will have a substantial impact precisely because those who know Israel have not been seduced by the media that doesn't know it and doesn't report it accurately. So those are some of the things that I think are going to be on our agenda once the war ends.
And I believe we have a session devoted to education either later today or tomorrow, so. And culture, so stay tuned. I think we have time really for one more, unfortunately. I see a lot of questions, so one more question, which I think Ariel has, or Gordon.
Come up, man.
Sorry.
So this is really rooted in cultural history. Since you mentioned the Zionist flag, and I know, Professor Sarno, you've written a lot on this. I found it curious that in our family photos from the 1930s, there's a photo from Western New York, a small community in Saunier, New York. It was a colony for epileptics, where my father was, and he served as kind of like a chazan or kolbo, and he had pictures of these events. And at one of these events, or a few of those events, they had displayed proudly the American flag and the Zionist flag. So I'm wondering, I'm sure it wasn't the only place. I'm sure they were modeling this after synagogues that did this throughout the country in the 30s. What did that flag evoke for Jews at that time?
So, since you kindly pointed it to me, and indeed I'm happy you did, first of all, you find it on the web. I did write on that. I hope to write more, God willing, on that. It's a very powerful question. We haven't paid sufficient attention to the culture of Zionism as it developed in the United States, and the flag was part of it. Flags were magical in America in the late 19th century. There was a kind of cult of flags. People collected flags, and there were books of flags of all different countries, and those who had new movements wanted flags. And so we find that these very early Zionists form a flag, and although Herzl writes about a flag, he gives us a drawing, but that's not the flag of Israel. The flag of Israel comes from Boston. It was flown, it was created in Boston. I wrote a bit about where it came from, and then it went to the Second Zionist Congress. But the reason it's so important is that it was subsequently flown at the American World's Fairs in St. Louis and subsequent World's Fairs. You can see, and it started out being called the Jewish national flag or something like that, only later, when the term Zionist takes off, it's that. Now, when the state came into existence, there was a big debate over what Israel's flag should be. But because Americans knew already that blue and white flag, the government decided, over many objections, to pick the American version of the flag. They, after all, needed America. And it was already known, so you didn't have to teach what it was, and that became the flag, but it morphed from a kind of Jewish flag of Jews with national aspirations to the flag of the Zionist movement to the flag of the State of Israel. And that's only part, but an important part, of how culturally Zionism has an impact on America. Take a look at how etrogim, they used to come from California. They were cheaper, easier to get. Nevertheless, etrogim from Israel won out. And we just had Sukkot, etrogim, 90% of etrogim come from Israel. Or another example is how even Haggadot, not the Reform ones, but Haggadot, L'Shana Haba'ah B'Yerushalayim, next year in Jerusalem, and then the adding very early in the 20th century of the singing of Hatikva. All of these cultural developments were no less important, I think, than the political developments. And they helped, they used to use a word, a made-up word, but you'll understand it. They helped to Zionize American Jews, made the ideas of Zion, the presence of Zionism there. So the flag is part of that larger story and did have a big impact on how American Jews, not all of them, but how American Jews began to think of themselves in Zionist terms.
And I would add the Israeli tchotchkes sold in synagogue gift stores.
Yeah.
And fashion shows,
Yeah.
and sisterhoods, Israeli fashion. So culture takes on many forms.
Unfortunately, we're going to have to stop, so I want to thank our panelists for giving us essential perspective, and for everyone participating in today's conversation. And it's my sincere hope that Zionism's future, which is rooted in its past, will continue to flourish. Amen.
It was